So welcome everyone to this Seven Foundation online event. We're very pleased to have Acacia Johnson with us today to talk about moving from documentation to storytelling. Acacia is an award-winning photographer who is based and working out of Alaska in the United States, doing a lot of stories for National Geographic, having been a National Geographic Explorer, TED speaker, ICP Award winner, etc. I'm really looking forward to this because I think this hits on one of the themes that we're constantly trying to get people to think about, which is actually how to research, investigate, and report on detailed issues, complex stories in a long-form way. So, Acacia, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I guess one kickoff question before you're going to take us through a presentation, and then to folks in the audience also to say when you want to pose questions, drop them into the chat. We'll bring them in mostly at the end, but potentially throughout. So a kickoff question is, how did you get into photography, and why did you get into photography at the beginning?
Well, as a matter of fact, that is one of the first things that I'm going to tell you about when we start my presentation.
All right. Well, oops. Let me bring that up then, and you can take us through.
Fantastic. All right. Well, hello, everybody around the world. And thank you so much to David for hosting and the introduction, and also to the Seven Foundation for inviting me to give this talk. I've given quite a number of talks throughout the years, but this is my first one specifically about visual storytelling techniques. And I think that how to approach a story visually is something that every photographer will do slightly differently. I always love learning how other photographers work. So I hope that by going into my approach, all of you can learn something new, or that it'll, introduce a new way of thinking through the process. So a little bit about me. My name is Acacia. I'm a photographer, artist, and writer from Alaska, and most of my work is focused in some way on the natural world, the environment, conservation, and the connections between people and place. Over the last 10 years, my work has spanned from more of a fine art way of working into the documentary realm, notably with over 10 stories for National Geographic and many other outlets. I did study photography in college, and I have an MFA in creative writing as well. But personally, I believe that many of the most valuable things we can learn as photographers do come from just being out in the world and in the field, and a whole lot of trial and error. So many of the things that I am going to share with you today are learned from that, and I hope that they will be useful. So the main things that I want to tell you about today are how I think about making a body of work, and importantly, the difference between a story and a topic in a photo project. And I'll also share 6 of my strategies for building a compelling photo story that are more like storytelling tools. And along the way, I'd really like to share with you the stories and the process of thinking behind my most successful projects. So that's where I'm going to dive in and start, is like, how did I get here anyway? And how did these learnings come about? So as mentioned, I grew up here in Anchorage, Alaska, which is a place with dramatic changes in seasons, in light, animal life, migration. Things are changing dramatically from one day to the next. And I've always been captivated by the quality of light and the kind of intensity of these changes. And so photography was early on a way for me to do something with that fascination. And so, but wasn't until I left Alaska to pursue photography at the Rhode Island School of Design that I really understood that my perspective as somebody from a more northern place might have any uniqueness. Of course, when you come from a place, you assume your perspective there is normal. But moving down to the lower 48 and moving through the world as a young person, I began to encounter stereotypes about the North as this sort of generalized, harsh, inhospitable place that held no value to any human life, And that kind of pushed my buttons. And as a young adult, I was also starting to learn, wow, it seems like sometimes the decisions made about what happens in the far north are made by people who may have never even been here and not really understand the context of what's going on. And so I started to make pictures about it. So early on, when I was still an art student, I developed my own kind of process where I would go on trips in like summer break or whatever to basically as far north as I could get. I would go to Iceland, the Alaskan Arctic, or northern Norway. This is underneath some river ice in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. Here's our camp there as well. And I was really driven by the sense of experience in a place, but I was essentially going without a plan. And I would move through the landscape looking for things that felt sort of resonant or like a moment of transcendence in the landscape. And these were some of the initial pictures I was making. They were very otherworldly. They were kind of abstract. They didn't give the viewer a lot of like context or information of what was happening. But at that point in time, I was more interested in like making the viewer stop and ask questions and try to orient themselves, even though there wasn't really a lot of like information in the pictures with which to do so. And then some of the pictures also were kind of constructions. This is my brother's glass ball collection, which wash up on storm-swept Alaskan beaches, or my mother's hands holding a juvenile and an adult bald eagle feather. And so this was the first time that I had really put together pictures from like, remote landscapes together into a body of work. And I think if there's one thing that helps photographers take the leap from kind of the amateur space into the professional realm, it is knowing how to create a cohesive series of pictures. This was the most important thing that I learned during photo school. And whenever aspiring photographers ask me, like, okay, I love photography, I have strong technical skills, what does it take? I think that this is the beginning of the answer, knowing how to make a series. And if you think about it, like most of the places in which photographs are exhibited and published and valued and paid for, things like, exhibitions and books, magazines, galleries, they all favor, series of pictures that fit together as a group. Often the sweet spot is sort of between like 15 to 30 pictures, maybe for an exhibition, less for a magazine, but having them be concise is important. And in these early kind of fine art realm thinking way that I started, I kind of identified two things that I think make a body of work really work nicely. One is there's a sense of cohesion, like there's something that makes all of the photos feel like they fit together as a group. And that could be color. Sometimes it's just the subject matter is like really obvious that pictures belong together. Sometimes it could be a particular kind of like visual style or sense of lighting, but there's something that makes all the pictures feel like, okay, they fit. And on the flip side, I think that in a strong series, each photo is also really distinct. It can stand on its own, that no two pictures are too similar. And when they're put together, there's a tension that emerges, like relationships or contrasts between the different pictures that create a sense of like a story or a narrative that moves us forward and makes us want to move from one picture to the next. So a balance between like things sticking together and also things being different and working together and moving forward. And so this initial project, you can see the results of this were definitely a more fine art realm. It was a series, not a story, but it made a nice photo book. And here you can see like pictures from different countries, completely different contexts. When put side by side, develop a sort of narrative potential. When you see them this way, the mind wants to draw connections between those two. So those were kind of early learnings that were going to be in the background of all of my thinking about making photographic stories going forward. So in this series, the cohesion, I would argue, was the color. I love color. That's just the magic of photography to me. And so color and light. So here we have kind of a gradient between these like greens to lighter tones and then dark again. other forms of cohesion. Maybe the photos all feel kind of cold. They feel a little otherworldly. There's not a lot of senses of like scale or perspective to really know where we are. So altogether, it feels very mysterious. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the tension points in this series later as we go along. But this was my first project that really felt sort of successful in any way, that got published around here and there, not in like magazine world stuff, but in, fine art websites and stuff. And people would ask me, are these pictures about climate change? And I had written some, artist statement that was like, oh yes, these pictures, otherworldly occurrences in the natural world that speak to the human connection to the northern landscape, like all of this stuff. Like, what does that even mean, And so when I was asked if this is about climate change, I'd say, oh no, not really. It's just my art, And it's funny to look back at that point and realize that there was a lot in my pictures that I wasn't really able to see at the time. But I was weirdly resistant to storytelling. It sounded like it was going to set me up for something boring. There was a documentary class that was offered at my school, but I didn't take it because I didn't see a lot of documentary photographs or didn't associate them with pictures that really had like a beautiful sense of color and light and all of these things that I loved. But I also think that deep down, I was a little bit lazy and also a little bit afraid. I think that I knew that if my photos were going to be about things and stories in the real world, that was going to require a lot more responsibility to do it right, to tell the truth, to do a good job and do research. And that sounded like a whole different set of demands. And also, I think I kind of questioned, like, do I have like the authority to do that, to be that kind of storyteller? So therefore, I didn't really learn about how that world worked. But then I graduated from school and I had to go out into the world and make a living. And so with no idea how the editorial industry works, anything like that, all I knew is that I wanted to spend as much time as I could in the Arctic and Antarctica. So my solution to that was getting initially a job as a photography guide on ships in the Arctic and Antarctica. And I worked there for 7 years, making over 55 trips and teaching photography to thousands of people. But it also meant that I spent, extended time in these really remote places and began to pay attention to a greater extent to the things that were happening there. I learned about the environments, and I would see these things like, for example, every spring in Antarctica when the temperature would get warmer and warmer every year, and there would be this pink snow algae that would spread across the penguin colonies, more vivid by the year, and like the color of the algae sped up the melting of the snow. And I thought, seems like people should be talking about this. And then we would go up to the Arctic from there, from the northern spring and summer season. We'd be sailing, like in this picture, past the west coast of Svalbard in March, when only 10 years previously, the whole coast would be would be solid sea ice until May each year. 2 months of sea ice loss in just 10 years. And I'd think, wow, shouldn't people be like talking about this? But my real turning point as a photographer and a storyteller came when I got a grant to spend a full winter in this remote community called Arctic Bay on the north of Baffin Island in the Canadian High Arctic. It's a place where the Inuit have lived for over 4,000 years, subsisting off of the land and sea in a semi-nomadic lifestyle, but have only really permanently settled in towns as recently as the 1960s, meaning that for some elders, a traditional lifestyle is still within living memory. And it's a place that has had enormous cultural shifts in just the span of a few generations. Now, straight out of art school, I went there thinking I was going to do a landscape project. But I moved in with a family and just accompanied them on everything that they did. And I quickly learned that to tell any story about the Arctic landscape in a place that has been inhabited is naturally a story about people. And so, for example, here, the sun is setting for the last time before 3 months of winter darkness. And so that project grew into more of a community portrait that was really interested in the traditions and relationships to people that people have had to land over time, but also the lives of people, young people growing up in the wake of colonization with the Canadian school system and satellite internet, like a completely different world. And it was the first time that I really came to understand sea ice. I think that when we often see pictures of the Arctic like this one, and we see these big open expanses, it looks empty to us. And so it's easy to assume like, oh, there's nothing there. But in reality, this is the surface of the ocean that is full of life and animals that people rely on for food. And it's actually like a living ecosystem. And so this project left me realizing like, wow, I'm taking pictures of real people and real things. This is a lot more responsibility, and I want to do it well. It also made me think, after that winter, a lot more about sea ice and also food security in the Arctic. In Nunavut, where I was photographing, over 70% of households are food insecure. The costs of groceries are astronomical. Like the last time I was there, it was $88 for a pack of soda. And traditional Arctic foods like seal, Arctic char, narwhal are some of the healthiest foods that people have access to. And I thought, wow, what would it take to do a photo series that could visually connect the idea of sea ice visually with concepts of like community and food and family and all of these things that it actually represents for so many people. And so after 3 years of applying for grants to cover the project and getting them rejected, I saved up and fundraised and went and I did the project in 2018. So I went back to the community where I had been living before, again, with no real plan, but I knew a lot of people, and it was the time of year when kids get out of school, families leave town and take their children on long trips to ancestral hunting grounds to teach them how to hunt, how to live off the land, and all of the traditional skills and knowledge. So here's the edge of the sea ice in Arctic Bay with everybody's sleds all ready to go. And I was very fortunate to be invited on 2 or 3 really longer trips with people and with sometimes groups of the community, taking kids on these long trips. And this one was a 12-day camping trip to places to hunt for like seal and Arctic char and learn all of these traditional skills. And over time, the photos became kind of the poetic thing that I had envisioned. This is a girl named Charlotte collecting drinking water for her family at their hunting camp. And my friend Darcy pulling a toy skidoo for his daughter during a tea break on a 9-hour snow machine trip to a fishing lake. And so by the end of it, I did actually have some pictures that I was happy with. And all of them, were pictures of real people with their real stories, all about how the community comes together to teach these skills to young people. But in my mind at the time, it was still like sea ice and community was like the main like topic label I had for it in my head. And so the next year I brought this story. I was really lucky to be invited to an event at National Geographic, and I presented the story to an editor. And the editor asked me, like, okay, well, we really love the photos. They're beautiful. Well, what is your story about? And I was like, sea ice and community, like really vaguely. And that's totally just a topic. But, as you've heard me talk about this story, you can probably tell I was learning along the way. I did know a lot of the context of why all these things mattered and how all these stories came together, but I didn't yet know how to articulate it, which brings me to a really important shift in thinking about what photos could do. So as I've come to think about it, I think that in a way, stories kind of make the world. Like everything that we believe and things that we value, all of that is in a sense a story. I think to quote, I think it was author George Saunders, Everything that we love and everything that we fear is a story. It really makes the world, I think, to a larger degree than many of us realize. And so when we can use photographs to create a compelling story, we're creating something that can like participate in this larger tapestry of stories that kind of create our world. You know, a story of photos can have impact. It can open people's minds. It can educate and illuminate and do this like broad spectrum of things. And that's not to say that, you know, that art can't do that, because it absolutely does, but it's in a different way. And so in my case, the leap that I really had to make was learning to articulate things as a story versus a topic. So in this case, my topic level idea was sea ice and community, but that's so vague. We don't even know where we are, who we're talking about. And so I think making this jump, you really got to get down to the most, cliche way of storytelling you've probably heard of, which is who, what, when, where, and why. If we can cover all of those things, that is like the bare bones of a story. So in this case, you know, I was able to distill what I was trying to achieve with my sea ice project to something like every spring on the north of Baffin Island, this Inuit community goes on camping trips into the landscape to teach their young people the skills and values that will prepare them to be leaders and providers in their communities and pass on their culture. Something like that. It can even get more concise than that, but addressing the who, what, when, where, and why was really important. And that made it a story. And that was enough of a story to be a full feature in National Geographic, including the cover of 5 international editions. And so, as you can imagine, this was like a major turning point in my life for several reasons. One of them being, importantly, that now my work was going to be reaching a really large audience. And that comes with responsibilities to tell the story well and to think about how it's being communicated to an audience who has no relationship to the subject matter. So since then, I have been working almost primarily in the documentary realm. And every time I start a project, I'm now thinking of it as a photo story. Photo stories are most commonly, you know, what we would see published in like a magazine or a newspaper. And when we open a publication like that, we have, whether we know it or not, expectations, I think, about what the pictures are going to tell us. And usually there's, you know, maybe 12 or so that will make it into a final edit. And in a photo story, I think each picture matters. They need to be intentional. They need to communicate all of those different pieces of the story in kind of a concise package. And so here's how I do it. The first thing that I will do anytime I have an idea for a photo story is to first figure out if it's a story in the first place. And very often, my idea that sounds like such a beautiful idea for photographs might just be a topic. But the first thing is to really map out the who, what, when, where, and why, and especially the why. Like the why is really important. And make sure that I can identify all of those pieces and also identify if they're things that I can actually make into pictures, which is not always easy. And so here's how I might kind of expand upon this. You'll notice I also added research, because in usually whatever idea I have, the further I dig into research, a bunch of other stuff is going to come up. And I've also added how, like what is the visual approach going to be? How is it going to achieve the goals of the story? And you'll see there's some other things added to the why section, like why you as the photographer versus somebody else? Why now? What's at stake? There's a bunch of important things that are going to need to be answered. And again, ideally, all of this should eventually be made apparent through the pictures or translate to the pictures. So the first thing I do in any story is think about the color and light and the emotions that is going to bring forward. Color is full of emotional possibility, I think whether we know it or not. For example, if you take just a second and think of the color red and all of the associations that you have with that color. Depending on where you're from in the world, you might think about like passion and urgency and heat or love, or even blood or violence or emergency. It's a really like emotionally charged color. Whereas if, you maybe live in some parts of Asia, you might associate it with happiness and luck and celebration and a whole different other range of emotions. And so choosing the colors that are in our photographs, I think, have a lot of potential for what the effect of those pictures can be. And tied into all of this, of course, is lighting. So here are two pretty similar pictures of women with their airplanes from a project that I did about Alaskan pilots. And in the picture on the right, I had control over when I could take the picture, and on the picture on the left, I didn't. So they were both taken on cloudy days in the winter. But in the picture on the right, by waiting until it was just on the edge of evening and bringing in an artificial light to like make the pilot stand out as more of the main character, it made the picture a lot more painterly, in my opinion, and really got to the sense of like winter dreaminess that I wanted for that particular project. So every time I take on a project, and indeed even just a single image, I'm always thinking about like the weather, the time of day, and what I can control about the lighting in terms of like artificial versus natural. I work almost exclusively with natural light, but every once in a while, a little bit can really help. And I also think that color is a fantastic tool for the cohesion that I was talking about earlier. Personally, I love it when my projects kind of evolve into having a color palette. And sometimes, like in this project, which was about community life during the polar night, the natural conditions will kind of steer this tremendously. So here we had the deep, dark Arctic blues of winter. But also this kind of tungsten orange that was like the color of the city lights, the color of the interior lights, the color of the sun setting. And it was like a thread of warmth that tied these pictures together and gave it a little bit more of a sense of being a community story. And then similarly, in the sea ice stories project that I told you about earlier, I had initially been really worried about that story being really visually like blank, because all of the pictures for the most part were taken on this like a literal white expanse of ice in 24-hour daylight. And so to work around that, I really sought out the color pink, which actually I was surrounded by because I was with all the women and girls most of the time. And so, we have associations with like femininity and warmth and all these things with that color. And so by seeking that out, it became like a through line between many, many photos in the series and gave it more of a warm community energy that I wanted from the project. And then I kind of threw this in at the last minute, but the last assignment that I did for National Geographic was about this brown bear coastline, and the colors green just dominated the story and had this kind of sense of like aliveness and health and other associations that I really liked. So color being always kind of in the background, I then get into kind of smaller level tools of what each picture is going to communicate. I think every time we take a picture, we're making decisions, not only about what is like literally in the frame, but also where that picture is operating on these kind of like axes, in a sense, between like context and mystery, or like distance and intimacy, or density and space. And I think a good photo story has some of all of these things in it. But it's really important, at least to me, when I'm photographing a project, to make sure that I'm getting a full range. So I'll have all of these polarities as like building blocks later to work with. And one of the most important things in documentary photography specifically, I think, is context, and making sure that we're communicating information to the viewer in a way that they can visually understand. For example, at the end of that sea ice project, I had been, as mentioned, 2 months on the ground, just photographing the ice at ground level. And I was so excited. And I took off in the plane to go home. And here was this huge crack in the sea ice running through the center of the frame. It's about 1 meter wide. And it was this like beautiful, abstract, painterly thing. I was so excited. And then later, I published the photo on Instagram. And the defining piece of feedback I got was people commenting, saying, "Oh my God, I was so afraid. I thought my screen was cracked." That was all they cared about. The picture communicated no information to the viewer, or at least not in the way that I had hoped. Meanwhile, in this photo, Inuit elder Olayuknakitarvik pulls his grandson in a kamutik, or a sled, over a crack in the sea ice on a 12-day journey, taking his family to the outpost camp where he grew up. This picture of a sea ice crack, as you can imagine, was the one that got published, simply because it had a lot more narrative potential. The crack, if you really want to read into it, could almost become like a symbol for, the knowledge of like older generations versus the younger, and this like split in the times. Like there's all these ways you could read into a picture like that. And so getting pictures that can actually communicate, I think, are really important. And where I see this issue of like not enough information the most is in wildlife photography. And I have been absolutely guilty of this myself. It is a big challenge, and indeed quite a achievement, to get close enough to a wild animal to get a really emotional portrait of one. And I think that a lot of photographers, myself included, can get quickly swept up in that. So on my first assignment for National Geographic, or wildlife assignment, it was about brown bears. And I was so proud of this picture and really surprised when it didn't get published. But in fact, this picture was named as one of Nat Geo's best wildlife photos of that year. And I remember initially just being so surprised and confused, like why? I worked so hard to get that really emotional portrait. But in reality, this picture doesn't give us hardly any information. Certainly, like including an emotional portrait can have a lot of value, but for all we know, it could be in a zoo. It could be anywhere in the world. And here we're seeing the landscape, the seasons, this behavior of all of these bears fishing together in this river. And we can tell that they're fishing because of the one that's kind of singled out on the right there is eating. And so it communicates so much more information than the other pictures. So this is an important thing to think about as we go along. And I have now kind of come more to peace with like not all of my pictures being super, super gorgeous and dreamy, as if, there are some that need to communicate more information and not be quite so pretty. So from there, I also think a lot about the kind of axis of distance and intimacy, exterior versus interior, and how we construct like a three-dimensional sense of space for the viewer. In a way, I think about building a photo story sort of like you would sequence like a movie. I like to have like a wide establishing shot and then give different distances for people to move around in space, so that in just a couple of pictures, you can really understand where you are and what it's like to be there. For example, in this story about brown bears, I loved this like wide overview where you can see kind of like the whole ecosystem. But then it was really important to me to include like pictures of like the ground, to give a sense of what are all the like levels of this ecosystem that make it such a great habitat for these animals. And what would it be like to like be there on the ground in that place? Especially with pictures of people, I think that varying distance strongly affects how we perceive the emotions of that picture. Like if you see a picture of somebody really far away in a big landscape, it can feel lonely maybe, or a sense of like isolation, versus if we have like a really close up soft portrait, it feels like an intimate moment. We feel a sense of closeness. And so I think moving around in space and getting variety of distances is a really great thing to kind of have as a part of any story. And then which one gets published is like a decision that happens later. And this one is a little bit trickier to describe sometimes, but like the difference between density and space, or you could think of like motion and stillness, or like volume and silence, but the way that pictures feel in terms of like action that's in them, or how like crowded the frame is. And so in the Sea Ice project, my challenge was that I'm very, very drawn to very serene images that have like a lot of space, and they're all very calm. But to have like a story with like a pace, like, like a piece of music or something with a tempo, it needs to vary. And so I was saved in this story by the fact that people had the most fantastical interiors of their tents, were homemade with all these amazing floral patterns. They were really dense, busy images with a lot of like, social activities going on. And so just visually being able to like put those side by side created a sense of like, of pacing that really balanced out the story well. And of course, some photographers are going to have kind of the opposite challenge. One of my friends, Laura Morton, has a fantastic project about the Silicon Valley tech boom. And kind of the star images of her project are these really, really dense pictures of all these people with their like computer equipment, or these like crazy rooftop parties. And they're wild and amazing and really beautifully layered. But if all the pictures are like that, it quickly starts to feel crowded, and the viewer has kind of no space to get like a sense of rest, to want to keep moving forward. And so she has these amazing pictures of people resting, often in their workplace, like this amazing picture of this man reclining in his AstroTurf. And this gives like a sense of breathing room and pause that really rounds out the pacing of the story nicely. So all of these things that I've been talking about so far are decisions that I'll be making as I go along, as I'm photographing, collecting pictures with the intention of editing it down to a smaller selection later. And really, some of the most amazing opportunities for building the story, I think, can come at the very end, when we figure out which pictures are going to sit next to each other, essentially. And one of the most interesting things that I think can happen are repeating patterns, and what in academia you might call formal relationships, or the relationships of shapes to other shapes, and like the connections that they make between them. There's an interesting phenomenon that I think many photographers will be familiar with, of making the same photo over and over again. And when in fact I broke down this particular series into like categories that I had subconsciously photographed, I was like, wow, look at that. I photographed all of these triangles, and then there's like a whole series of these like magical building blocks, or I don't know what you want to call this genre, but very much distinct visual patterns that repeat over and over again. And I do think that sometimes especially if you have like a bit larger of a number of images to work with, like 20 or 30, having some patterns repeat can be really satisfying to a viewer. There's something that gives it like a sense of cohesion or connection, or like, okay, we've been seeing different pictures, but here's a reminder visually, formally, that like this is still the same story. And this is something that I love to see in other photographers' work. It feels like this like amazing discovery to encounter it. I really am a fan of this Italian photographer, Alessandro Cinque, who has an amazing 8-year project about indigenous communities affected by large-scale mining across South America. And I encourage you to check out his website and really look through for these patterns in the series, because they're amazing and very smart. But here's an example of like a repeating kind of image or theme, like windows, looking out, looking in, that happens over and over again in his work. But he also has some fantastically smart decisions about what pictures are put side by side. And in these images, without captions, I imagine the one on the left to be like a school courtyard of a school, maybe, and the one to be in an agricultural field, which are two completely different places, But the gesture that the boy is making, mirrored by the gesture of the woman with the corn, make an immediate connection between those two pictures in a really visually satisfying way. Similarly, these two side by side, I imagine that the rock is the material that is being mined, and the shape of it, to me, mirrors the shape of the pile of them in the next picture. So moving from one to the next, there's almost this emotional sense of like increase, or things like getting out of control, piling up. It gives like a little bit of a visual sense of like a burial mound, or something is happening because of that rock that's being held up. And so that's just my personal reading, but I just want to show you this as an example of the way that in which we put pictures next to each other has a big impact on how the viewer responds. And a lot of that can be really difficult for us to see ourselves, which is why it's really helpful to work with a photo editor or just with a friend who can help us see these patterns and visual connections. So I have now shared a number of storytelling tools and approaches. But a lot of the work that I've showed you so far has been from projects that have taken me months or years, or been long-term things. Certainly the work I just showed you as well was an 8-year project. And as I personally moved more into the realm of documentary photography, getting a photo assignment sounded like the most exciting thing in the world. But it comes with other parameters. And this thing would happen as I started getting my very first assignments, where, an editor would write me, and I would be so flattered and so excited. And she'd tell me about the project, and then would say, okay, well, I've put together like a PDF of like visual references for you. And she would email over, it was almost always a woman, email over a PDF, and it would be like pictures from my website and my Instagram. And I would open it up and I would see the most lucky moments of my entire photographic career all on one page, like these chance moments of like light and composition and just things that like fell out of nowhere that felt like a gift when they happened, and the editor would be like, all right, so this is what we had in mind, and you think that 5 days is enough? And I was like, oh no, but that is in fact the realities of many a photo assignment. And so from here, I want to like share with you kind of my process of trying to pull off a story with less time in the field and less resources, really, which is often the reality of making an assignment for a magazine. So a couple of years ago, in 2021, I heard about this island in Alaska where thousands of walruses come ashore every summer. And if you can get there, there's a visitor program, and you can actually camp there and just be surrounded by the walruses around the clock. The walruses are interesting to me for a number of reasons. They're a keystone species. They're very vulnerable to sea ice loss, but they don't get a lot of attention, or as much attention in the conservation realm as like polar bears do, for example. And so I thought that it would be a great story for National Geographic. And so I wrote to an editor and was like, I want to go to this walrus island. And she said, okay, we are at maximum capacity for animal stories. So can you turn it into a travel story pitch? And so I thought, at first I was kind of disappointed. But then I realized, like, actually, this is an opportunity to do something really different. And so this is where I started with that idea, the very basics. Come to this island to see walruses in the wild. And as you can see, it's just like the what and the where. The who is kind of vague, like maybe it's implied being the traveler. So I'd start mapping this out. Here we have, if it's the traveler's experience, the process of getting there, experiencing the walruses, and also camping on this island. But if I really think about it, this is enough information for like an Instagram post, It's not really like enough for a full in-depth story in like a journalistic publication. But I did my research. I spent a couple of weeks calling different, people who had worked there, biologists, people who worked for the Fish and Game Service, and was really able to totally flesh this out. And fortunately, there was a lot there. There were a lot of connections to conservation. By visiting the island, people could kind of get to see what research was like, and in fact, kind of indirectly support the continuing of research there. There were also interesting connections to the Alaska Native communities nearby who still hunt for walruses there every fall, and in fact help to co-manage the sanctuary, and so many other things that really made the place interesting. And of course, if you recall, this is now like the map of all of the things that have to get turned into photographs. And because it was a story not for the print magazine, but for digital, which has a lower budget, I would have a maximum of 10 days in the field. So I made the plan. And I forgot about this. So this is kind of how the storyline itself would kind of evolve from that initial thing. Travel to this remote Alaska island to see walruses in the summer, learning about ancient traditions and supporting vital research about the Bering Sea ecosystem. That is a mouthful. Like, not all of that is probably going to make it into the title, but it covers the who, what, when, where, and why. And all of those pieces are going to be things that I'm photographing or trying to illustrate that will make their way into like the bigger story. And so just in the last couple of years, I have actually gone so far as to start making shot lists. And when I was a younger photographer, going to these places without a plan, I really believed that kind of intuitive approach was going to get me the best pictures. And, that was how like the magic happened. But really, man, it is a bummer if you go and, make a bunch of beautiful pictures, but miss one like really, really essential piece of the story. And so there's like an incomplete example of what a shot list for this project might have looked like. There's all of these different aspects of the travel experience getting to the island. When it comes to the walruses, I wanted a big variety of distances, so we feel like we're zooming in and out, any kind of behavior that I could capture. And then I really wanted like a rich sense of place, a big overview, a sense of scale, a sense of like the ground, like all of these different things. So the first thing that happened was that there was a weather delay, and we were stuck in the village of Togiak for 5 days. 5 days of my total field time, just like out the window and thinking, oh no, it's doomed, But finally the weather calmed down, and I could see why we really had to wait, because our transport to the island seen here was in a very small boat, 30 miles out into the open waters of the Bering Sea. And so we arrived at the island and thinking like, okay, now I'm only going to have 5 days. So here is our camp that we set up. My brother came with me as an assistant. And the first thing that I did that day, and that I usually do if I can, was kind of assess the visual possibilities that I was going to have to work with and refine in the days to come. So this was one of the first hours on the island, the field technicians going out to do a wildlife count to contribute to the ongoing research on the island. And you can kind of see some walruses down there on the shore, but they're not really prominent. And I thought the light was really harsh and flat, or not flat, but just not great. I didn't really like what it looked like, but I filed that away as kind of a mental item. Like, okay, I want to improve upon that picture later. Another vantage point that I really thought had potential was this overhead view of like a lot of walruses together on the ground in this kind of jigsaw puzzle. But it looked kind of like a picture that I had seen a lot before, and I wanted to somehow be able to improve upon that later on. And so in the days that followed, it was mostly just really misty and gray, which is initially from a light perspective, I was kind of like bummed about that. But you can see from this selfie here, the kind of vantage point, we were for the most part up above the walruses looking down on them, which was great because we could spend all day there without disturbing them, and they're really sensitive to disturbance. And actually, the soft lighting turned out to be really lovely. One of my favorite photographic pieces of equipment, which I try not to talk about equipment, but I really love to have a polarizer with me because it can pull the surface reflections off of the water. So it really allowed the walruses to feel like they were like coming forward and glowing out of the sea. And then a little while later, again, following the field technicians on their wildlife counts, I was able to get this picture in softer lighting conditions. And you can see down there on the beach, there's a bunch of walruses and the reef is kind of trailing out into the wider ocean. And so placing these two side by side, this is essentially like the same picture, but the one on the right I thought was way more successful. I loved how the lighting turned out, and it actually later would end up being the lead shot of the story. And so we're getting to like the last day of the whole assignment. And on my like in-reach weather forecasting device, a GPS communication device, I could get this really, really primitive weather forecast. And we were going to have a little window of clear weather just on like the morning of the day we were going to leave. And because it was summer in Alaska, it was light almost all night. And so I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and hike all the way back out to that rocky outcrop where the walruses hauled out. And lo and behold, it was really worth it for the quality of light. So got there right at sunrise. This very elusive fox appeared and sat next to me for all of like 2 seconds and then disappeared. And down there on the shore, again, looking for this kind of picture, the walruses were gathering and making this like otherworldly chiming sound as they gathered in the golden morning light. And it was like, okay, we got that picture, or at least improved upon the one that I had really wanted to get. And so in the end, of course, I worked with an editor to put together the story. And if I had sort of had my way, the selection probably would have looked something like this. Of course, I wanted everything to look like a painting or look very dreamy and beautiful. But here we have like a close-up of the walrus, some a little bit more distant, moving in and out of space. I also liked kind of the sense of mystery of that skull image, and then a little bit of the human experience on the island, like paddling that tiny raft out to the boat and back. But for the story to really be complete and give the full sense of the travel experience, it also needed all of these pictures that were simply a lot more contextual or held a lot more information, like pictures of like the plane ride there, the surrounding landscape near the village, the culture of the village, harvesting many salmon at the time we were there, and also the interior of the cook tent there on the island. So those kind of balanced out with the beautiful, dreamy stuff that I was all into. And oh yeah, here's one example of decision making together with an editor. So the image on the left, I initially selected. I liked it a lot. I liked the way that the blurred out grass in the foreground gave this kind of splash of color and contrast. But the editor, when she was putting the images together, felt that there wasn't enough movement in the full series. And so she selected this one where the walrus is exhaling in the background because it gave just like a little bit more of a sense of motion in the larger group. So that's an example of like a sequencing decision that you might make together with an editor. And here's what the final piece looked like. Kind of fun to think back to like the original rough story map and then see it all come to life in the real world. And I was pretty happy with it. It was pretty well received. What I liked about it so much was that it was the first time I had really done a natural history or wildlife story that I really felt also encapsulated the sense of light and color and dreaminess that I am personally really drawn to. And so although this picture wasn't initially published in the digital article, it was a few months later in the print magazine, which was an honor and exciting, and I liked the way that it turned out. So again, when I look back to my early life as a photographer, and fearing that making a plan or doing advanced research, all of this stuff would, crush my possibilities for like magic and intuition and amazing encounters in the field. This image really reminds me that that is indeed not the case. This picture was not planned. I was taking a picture just of the walrus skulls on the porch of the field technician's cabin when this fox just like leapt into the picture. And later on, it was listed among Nat Geo's best wildlife photos of that year, completely unplanned. So it really reminds me that, you know, the best photos are still very often gifts from being in the right place at the right time. So anyway, that kind of concludes my journey through visual storytelling techniques. But I really encourage, you know, anyone who's listening who's interested in this line of work to realize that, you know, no matter where you come from, your background, like all of our stories and perspectives do have value. It's kind of a weird time to be working in photojournalism. When, you know, things like what is the truth is sometimes called into question, but I really think it needs all of us, and all of our stories really matter. So I hope you learned something that will help. Thank you.
That's absolutely fantastic, Acacia. Thank you so much for that. You've given not only an overview of incredible work, but also really detailed insights into the process, which I think is incredible. So we've got a couple of questions that have cropped up as you were talking, which I'll ask on behalf of those people. But to everyone else who's listening and watching, if you want to drop a question in, we have some time for Q&A, so you can put those questions into the comment. One of the questions was from Joe, and he wondered, how much is the shot list that you worked with on the story you described something that you produced, or did the editor produce, or was there some relationship between the two?
That's a great question. It depends a little bit on the story, I would say. Often, if I am working on an assignment, the editor will have some kind of requests, but usually they're kind of high level. Like, for example, on the story I did about bears recently, I remember the editor wanted pictures of the bears where light is shining off of their eyes, and pictures of bear viewers where you see people's faces. And like, that was about it, you know, and then I was left to go. So whatever an editor requests, I will absolutely make that like top priority. But many of the other things are my own priorities that I build around what I want the story to look like.
Yeah. There was a question from Dan. He was wondering, in the breakdown of who, what, when, where, why, which I think is extremely important, and of course one of the foundational ways of thinking about sort of journalistic practice to cover and provide that sort of information, he was wondering whether all stories have to have people in them to answer the question of who.
I don't think so. That brings up kind of another thing that I didn't mention, though, which is that in, you know, a lot of my work is in kind of environmental topics, environmental stories about animals or landscapes. And you do not technically have to have people in stories. You know, you could have a story about animals, but often it really, really helps a conservation story, for example, to have like at least one human character. I think that including some human aspect gives people kind of like an entry point into a landscape or a situation that they may be totally unfamiliar with. And it can make it feel like it's more like it's something that belongs in our human world in a different way. And so you don't have to have it, but it's really useful.
Yeah. Got a couple of questions, inevitably and understandably, about how to finance a career and how to do this sort of work.
Oh, Lord.
Yes. So I'll show this one.
Mm-hmm. I do deal with economic struggles, indeed. Thank you for asking. Yeah, it's like, I was chatting with some other photographers recently. It's truly like a feast or famine lifestyle from time to time. And unfortunately, I find that, editorial photography alone doesn't pay the bills enough. And so the way that I kind of structure my freelance career is, focusing on the documentary work that I really, really want to make every year and kind of figuring out how I can get that funded, ideally, like maybe through grants. I love grants as a way to fund photo work, or see if I could get an assignment for it. And then from there, kind of figure out like what's going to be the constellation of all of the other things that I'm going to need to do to make a living. And that's really different for everyone. But for me, it might look like, some commercial work or, brand collaborations, social media partnerships, or consulting or public speaking. But everybody, some people even have like different side jobs that supports their work. And I wish it wasn't that way. Of course, I wish that this was, a fully high-paying career. But for most people, in reality, it's a constellation of different things.
Which has historically been the case. I mean, while there are terrible declines in the number of staff photographers at publications and so on, historically from the 1950s onwards, some of the most successful and now famous photographers were freelancers who juggled multiple sources of income, had those moments of feast and famine. So that's not to diminish the struggle, but just to understand it's not actually just a contemporary problem. It's been an historic problem for that. There was an earlier question about where you talked about in the CI story fundraising, and you talked about doing grants. They were not successful, and anyone who writes grants knows that you have a 90% plus failure rate in grants. Very few get accepted. And then you talked about other forms of fundraising. What were the other forms of fundraising other than grants that helped enable that story?
That's a great question. For that particular project, I did like a fine art print sale specifically to raise money for that project. And I also got some support from the Arctic guiding company that I worked for. And I don't think that I did crowdfunding on that one, but I did for the project before that, where I spent the winter in the Arctic. That was actually a really big lesson learned. I had applied for a Fulbright grant and won it, naively thinking that they would just like pay for the full scope of the project, whatever it was. But actually, it was only $15,000 for a full year. And so I had to raise a lot of money on Kickstarter to be able to pull that one off.
Indeed. Let me just switch the view. And then I think this is a really interesting question, given the amount of planning you do and kind of the storyboard or mind map that you create and the shot lists and so on. How do you balance that with the unplanned opportunities like the last photograph of the fox, for example?
That's a great question. I think depending on kind of the time span that I'm working with, there's kind of two ways to do it. One is to just first prioritize the things that you need to cover all of the baseline of the story, and then set aside more time to just go and explore. But more often I find, for example, if I know that on my list for myself is like an overview shot of an area at sunrise, then, I'll spend a couple of hours probably going to that place and waiting and just being there and trying to stay open and relaxed and noticing things. I think that the moments of coincidence or serendipity kind of arrive on their own.
Yeah.
And also, just like when you're in the field and you see something amazing, going for it, because sometimes those things, the most amazing pictures you never could have foreseen.
Yeah. Like the financial questions, people are always keen to know about pitching stories. What's your advice on pitching stories to editors or publications?
Oh, that could be a whole other talk. But I think, like, top level, making sure that the story itself is really robust. And also that all, as mentioned, that all the things can actually be made into photographs. But importantly, I think that doing your homework about whether that story is really a fit for that publication and their kind of editorial goals is really important. Researching if they have published anything like that before, and being prepared to make the case of why they should publish it right now versus anybody else or in another outlet.
Yeah. Yeah, I would also say to people listening, if you want some advice from photo editors on pitching, we've done a series of presentations with photo editors. I think we have nearly a dozen now, some really prominent photo editors. You can go to the Seven Foundation video collection on our website and look at those presentations by the editors. They get very granular with the advice on how to pitch to them. There's lots of practical tips in there, so I think that's something worth following up on. We have a couple more questions. Let me see. Kind of a question about impact and the communities that you work with.
Man, that is a great question, and one that varies dramatically from place to place. I have not ever had an assignment that has allowed me to spend extended time in a remote community. It's always been self-funded work. What I have normally done in my best efforts to have the impact that I can is things like, renting a room in somebody's house to provide them some income off of that. If I'm traveling out on the land, paying for people's gas, and also trying to teach photo workshops for young people if I'm staying somewhere for an extended period of time. Yeah. And I'll also say that, as my career has progressed and, I become more familiar with the issues impacting a certain community, which you might not really be able to have initially as an outsider, it has definitely changed the focus of the kind of work and storytelling that I want to do there, aiming more towards things that I think could actually be beneficial to the communities themselves, such as food security, for example, in that one.
Yeah. So a couple of technical questions. This one's in all caps, but I don't think that means it's angry. It's just asking about black and white projects. You focus mostly on color, and you talked about the relationships of color and so on. Would you ever make black and white projects? And some further thoughts on how you edit color.
Yeah, that's a great question too. I have tried to take black and white photos, but I think that I see in color. And I think that photographers who are really exceptional at black and white see more in like tonality and light than as color focused as I see. So maybe I could train and become good at it, but as of now, it just doesn't really interest me. I also recently spoke to a younger photographer who had initially brought black and white work to her first meeting with editors at National Geographic, and they said, "Well, if you want to work for a magazine like this, you'll need to learn to shoot in color." That was the first time I had heard of a story being told like that. So take that, what information you will, from there. But I think there are different uses for both. In terms of editing, I tone my photos in Adobe Bridge, which is Camera Raw editor, which is nothing super fancy. But my general mindset around color editing is that if I'm editing much at all, it's to bring it closer to exactly what it looked like in person. When I take pictures in Camera Raw, they're very flat. I deliberately set it that way so that I have maximum editing room later. But for when you work for magazines, you have to supply the raw files. So there's definitely need to stay within the realm of reality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And for ethical reasons also, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting
Yeah.
tech question. Is AI affecting your photography or creative process at the moment?
That's a good question. Not personally. I know some photographers who are working with it in interesting ways to kind of make mood boards for their upcoming projects, like thinking about how they could take their own approach to apply it to a totally new topic, for example. But so far, the most use that I have seen of it is in photo editing software, like for example, being able to like select the sky to bring the brightness down or something. It's just like one click versus time consuming painting and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I'll also add, just while we're all still here, one thing that I forgot to mention, I think, is the value of captions in pictures.
Yeah.
In documentary work, like supplying really detailed, informative captions is actually like a huge part of my work and workflow. And I dream of the day when AI might be able to make that process a little faster because it's very
Yeah.
time consuming.
Yeah. Absolutely. Look, we're coming to the end of our time, and I know you have another commitment that you have to get to. So there were more questions, but we will send you the chat on those. And I apologize to those people that we can't just extend everything indefinitely to incorporate those. We've covered a lot. We've taken up a lot of your time. And Acacia, it's been an absolutely fantastic presentation, very insightful, very informative. You've been very generous, actually, in giving away a lot of that knowledge. And yeah, I know that as people are going to come back to this recording, which will be up on our website within a week or so, to watch in more detail and learn more. So thank you for everyone in the audience who attended. And Acacia, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you who were here. And hope there's something good there. So.